So tonight we're talking about stress and relaxation. I would probably say that I'd expand the term relaxation. That's obviously part of what we'll talk about, but just really looking more broadly at coping strategies, being able to understand, first of all, what is it that stress is, how do we respond to stress, and then being able to start examining that in terms of how do we typically try to cope, and are there ways that we can add new strategies in, just to feel like we're developing our repertoire of skills to a larger extent. Again, as I've done with sessions in the past, I'm going to talk to this, applying it to you yourself as an individual, you yourself as a coach, but I think there's a lot of ways that you can be then applying this to the athletes and teams that you're working with. As I've said in the past, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions throughout the presentation. We've got a small group tonight, but I'm happy to answer questions as we go through. You can put them in the chat box as well if you prefer to do it that way, or we can wait till the end and have a question and answer at that point as well. So we can be pretty flexible with this. That being said, I do want to get started with, this is an equation that comes out of a book called Peak Performance. It's by Stallberg and Magnus. They've written a couple of books and I would recommend them. You can just do, they write their books together. But as I said, this one comes out of Peak Performance, and the equation that underlines a lot of that book is that stress plus rest equals growth. And a lot of times when we think about stress, we think about it as this negative thing. We think about it as something that we want to avoid, and that's not helpful for us. But what they're saying is that we actually need periods of stress combined with obviously periods of rest to have this growth process. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually go through and start looking at the definitions of these terms. I think they're pretty straightforward, but really want to underlie here that stress isn't always a bad thing. Stress can actually be a very good thing, a very helpful thing. We just need to make sure that stress doesn't become all-consuming, that we do have periods of downtime and periods of recovery, because that's what will really help us to move forward. And so there are lots of different ways that we can understand the stress cycle, understand why we get stressed, and then obviously use that to try to manage our stress and hopefully have some of that good stress and less of the bad stress. So that being said, I did mention that I wanted to define these terms. I think they are pretty straightforward, but stress is the term physical or mental strain resulting from demanding circumstances. And so when we think about stress, sometimes we think about physical stress, sometimes we think about mental stress, just recognizing that it can be one, both, or a combination. And this happens when we're under tension, when we're being challenges, when we feel like we're in a circumstance that's challenging our resources. And so we obviously need to respond to that, but it's creating that demand on ourselves. Rest, again, pretty straightforward, but it's this period of resting, relaxing, or regenerating. And again, this needs to have both a physical and mental capacity to it. We sometimes think about rest more from a physical perspective, but mental rest and mental recovery is going to be really important as well, just to feel like we've got the mental resources to then go out and focus or to engage in ways that are going to help us to be effective. The combination of these two things, when they're done with a fairly even balance or the right balance for you individually, is that we get into this process of growth. And again, growth is pretty straightforward, especially when we're looking at a sport perspective, but it's this process of developing or maturing. And again, this is going to be that physical growth, but also that mental growth. And so when we look at growth on a soccer pitch, it's going to be how you're getting better as an athlete, looking at the skills that the athletes are doing, but also looking at the mental development and how they're coping with things, how they're managing emotions, how communication happens. And again, those are things that can be expanded to you as a coach. Like I said, it's about being able to understand these things and start looking through how we experience stress and rest, and also recognizing some of the growth that we've experienced over the past several months, several years. You can look at it from whatever time frame you want, but just being able to recognize the growth that you have achieved. With this presentation, there isn't a specific handout. I know some of the presentations I've done have had handouts, some haven't. But that being said, I do still want to have reflection. It's just maybe less structured than some of the worksheets we've used in the past. The first thing I want you to think about, and this is just jot down on your own, grab a piece of paper, use the notes section in your phone, whatever you want to do. What am I stressed about right now? And again, going back to that definition of stress, physical stress, mental stress, a taxing, demanding situation, just jot down a few things that you feel you're stressed about. I'm not going to give you a ton of time, but a minute or two just to get those thoughts going. And so I know that we've gone through a period of, I think, relatively high stress individually and collectively from a very global perspective. And I can see people putting some of their answers into the chat box and yeah, looking at social distancing situations and all the precautions that need to be taken. Yeah, I think definitely it feels like, and from my perspective anyways, there are so many changing perspectives in terms of recommendations and guidelines, and as things keep opening up, looking at how things are shifting that way. And so making sure that we're able to adjust to what's reopening, but also continuing to keep ourselves and other people safe. And I can see that being very stressful because it's something that's unusual and that we're needing to adjust to. From a soccer perspective, just the general soccer landscape. And so moving through COVID, obviously having all those shutdowns, having games canceled, tournaments canceled, but then also with return to play, what does that look like? What kind of safety measures and guidelines do you have to have in play, and making sure that everyone understands them, coaches, athletes, parents, so that you can implement them in a safe way and make sure that people are still able to get out and play, but just with the guidelines that we need to be operating under. So again, I think there are lots of different things that we might be feeling stressed about, and those are a couple sports situations potentially, but we can also think about areas outside, because as we've talked about in previous sessions, our day-to-day impacts our sport and vice versa. So anyways, it's just a chance to get us thinking about this, and hopefully as we move through, you'll start to have a chance to reflect on this in different ways. So sometimes when we make this list, maybe we evaluate it in a negative way. I'm stressed about these things. These are negatives. These are things that I feel are outside of my control. Sometimes there's that judgment. We also want to look at the other possibilities. Sometimes when we actually write things down and make a list and we start to externalize, even just from our thoughts onto a piece of paper, sometimes we start thinking about it in a different way, whether it seems more manageable or just a different perception. Sometimes that can happen too. But what we want to do, as I mentioned, is just start answering kind of similar questions as we go through, or an expansion of questions as we go through the session tonight. And what we'll build on is looking at, how do I notice that I'm stressed? What are things that come up for me? What are things that I do that maybe help me to cope with the stress? Are there things I'm doing that are less helpful? But what we want to do before we get into some of those pieces is actually start looking at stress. And this next slide, again, is a fairly similar definition to the one I had on the previous slide, recognizing that stress is our emotional and physiological response, so that physical and mental, to perceived threat. But this threat can be real or imagined. So this threat can be something that's actually happening in front of us, or it can be something that we're worrying about, something that we're thinking through and unsure about how it's going to play out. And what we're actually noticing is that our perception of that event. So if it's something that we feel that we can control, something that we feel is out of our control, something we feel we have the capacity to deal with or maybe not deal with, that perception actually controls our stress reaction. So if we think about a certain situation, for example, a parent wants to talk to you after practice and you think, hey, this parent maybe isn't very nice, they've yelled at me before, they get upset, whatever it is, you perceive that request as a negative based on past experience, your perception is probably going to be potentially more negative, and that's going to trigger a larger stress response than if you think, you know what, they just want to talk to me about X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. That's going to be a very different perception. And so sometimes, again, that threat is going to be very physical. It's something that's in front of us. As a basic example, it would be if you're out hiking in the mountains maybe and you see a bear on the trail. That would be a very real threat. And obviously there are different components to that in terms of how close it is, if it sees you, those kinds of things. But we typically have a stress response because we can see it there. Sometimes it's going to be imagined. So same example, if you're out hiking and you're thinking, oh, there are bears here, and you're looking, you're trying to see where they are. Another imagined example of stress would be, okay, we've got practice tomorrow and I'm really worried about how all this distancing is going to go. I'm not sure if people are going to follow it properly or how I'm going to have to adapt. So that can be a perceived threat because you start to worry it through. It's not actually happening yet. Anyways, with these couple things in mind, what I want to do is actually take you through the stress response. And this is something that is evolutionarily wired. So our bodies and our minds go through this process as a way to keep us safe. And so this is something that if we go back to the days of the cave people, they were obviously in a different situation than us. They had to work harder in some ways to survive, had to hunt for their food, gather, create their homes and their safety spots. And really use society as a collective to help each other survive. Things are kind of different right now in terms of what our society and what our day-to-day looks like, but this stress response has continued as a way to help us try to respond to threats and maintain our survival. And so with that in mind, you'll see the stress response here. Initially, we have that event. And so this is just an event or a trigger. And again, as we talked about on the last slide, it can be real or imagined. It can be one of those things that is actually physically there or something that we're starting to think about. Again, on the last slide, we had that perception or that evaluation where we start to think, is this event, is what's happening right now, or is what I'm imagining something that is within my capacity to control? If it is, you feel like you've got the coping resources, the ability to navigate it in a fairly fluid and positive way, you might still have a minor response, just make your body kind of making sure you're okay to navigate it. You might feel like you don't have much of a response at all. If you evaluate this event in a negative way as something that this is overwhelming, this is something that I don't have control over, this is something I've never encountered before, you're probably going to evaluate that in a much more negative way, a much more stressful way. And that's where the rest of the cycle starts to become really amplified. So again, going back to that example of the bear on the trail, I mentioned how close it is, if it sees you, those kinds of things. You might see a bear, but it might be down the hill across the river. And so it's still maybe a little bit stressful to see it. You might have a very minor response, but you know that you're not really in danger because it's very difficult for that bear to get to you. On the other hand, if you see the bear 10 meters ahead of you and it's looking at you, that's a very different evaluation. You're probably going to feel a lot more threatened. If it's on the trail, but it hasn't noticed you and you can see a way to get away, again, you're probably going to have a stress response, but maybe slightly different than the bear that's staring you in the face. So again, that evaluation plays a big role in terms of how the rest of the response goes. From there, what happens is our brains trigger a variety of different chemical responses in our body as a way to try to activate that safety response for us. I'm not going to go into the various chemical responses, but basically it's triggered throughout our body and a way to help us to just try to respond properly. Based on those chemicals, based on those hormones that are released, we then have a physical and emotional response that are triggered. And lots of different things that happen here. I'll go through a few examples, but not necessarily the whole list. From a physical perspective, when we have that stress response, when those chemicals and hormones are released, we're going to notice that our heart rate increases. Again, our heart rate is increasing because it's trying to pump blood through our body faster as a way to help us to respond to that threat. Heart rate and breathing are very interrelated, so we're going to notice that our breathing rate increases. Our blood, even though it's circulating more, it starts to actually kind of condense more into the core of our body. So we don't have as much blood flow to our limbs. It's going to be more to our essential organs, essential processes kind of in the core of our body. So because of that, you might notice that your hands and your feet feel a little bit cold. You might feel a little bit sweaty because of that, kind of get your clammy hands. A lot of times we'll see that pupils dilate, trying to let in more light, trying to be able to process things and get more information. So those are lots of different physical responses that we have. Again, sometimes when we feel that way, we feel our heart racing, we feel our hands go clammy, we feel maybe a little bit nauseous, again, because of how the blood flow is changing in our stomach. We don't interpret that as a very pleasant thing. And so that can then amplify this response because we're interpreting those responses or those physical reactions in a more negative way as well. So that can sometimes build on it too. We also have an emotional response. We start to react psychologically, mentally, emotionally to the signals that our brain is sending off into those chemicals that are in our body. So one of the things that can happen is it can seem like our thoughts are just racing. Again, because of how our brain is trying to process information, it's trying to filter through everything and really get down to that most important information. So sometimes it feels like our thoughts are racing. Once we feel like we've kind of identified the most important thing, sometimes it feels like our attention narrows down and just locks in on that. And even sometimes in that state, it can be difficult to shift our attention to other important things or other aspects that we might want to be considering. We sometimes feel like we're getting really irritable, really aggressive. We might feel like we are really overwhelmed. We might, there can be lots of different things that happen from that kind of psychological, emotional reaction. Again, these are primed because they lead into some of our behavioral responses, both the physical responses and the emotional responses. In terms of behavioral, Everyone's going to be familiar with the fight or flight as a way to respond to that adrenaline and respond to stress. Researchers have started talking more about a freeze mechanism too, where we freeze up sometimes in the face of stress. So when we fight, obviously if we see that bear on the trail and it's 10 feet away and staring at us, we might have to prepare ourselves to fight that bear off. And so that's where having that increased blood flow, the changes in muscle tone, the changes in terms of how our brain is processing information and making decisions, it helps to set us up to have that increased aggression to try to fight that bear off. Sometimes we want to fly, have that flight mechanism. And again, if we see that bear, but it's maybe hasn't seen us yet, and we're able to sneak away, you kind of back away slowly to get that safe distance, and then maybe you're running as fast as you can in the other way once you deem it necessary. And again, that running, that speed, that flight is helped out by the physical and emotional responses that we're having, by the changes that are actually occurring in our body. Sometimes though, it's going to be best just to freeze up, and you hear the term deer in the headlights. Some animals, and sometimes with humans as well, it's helpful for us to freeze up. And so with that freezing behavior, it's okay, I'm going to be safest if I just stay still and don't move. So the bear is kind of moving around. It hasn't seen me yet, but there's not really any way for me to get away. I'm just going to stay here, stay really still, and try not to make myself seen. Obviously, that's those examples are all within like a bear in the mountains kind of general perspective. But we can think about how those responses apply in our day-to-day life. So are there situations where we really feel like we're stressed and we have that fight response? Or maybe not necessarily physically hitting someone, maybe that happens sometimes, but we're looking at how that aggression is released. So anger outbursts, getting really irritable, clenching your hands into fists, those can be different things that happen from that fight response in a day-to-day perspective. Similarly, we can have that flight response where we want to just avoid. And typically what we see is avoidance behavior where, well, a parent asked me to talk after practice, you know what, I'm going to say I'm really busy and have to get to something else. And you kind of avoid that conversation, or you try to minimize eye contact. You're not looking them in the eyes as a way to try to avoid some of the conflict that you might feel is coming or has already started. Same thing with freezing up. We might notice that we just have stuff to do or have tasks that we need to get accomplished for coaching or for work or for other things. And we just sit there and we stare at the screen and we feel like we can't get started. So there can be different ways that the fight, flight, or freeze actually apply in our day-to-day behavior outside of that bear in the mountains on the trail example. Sometimes our behavior is going to be really effective. It's going to be really effective in terms of coping with that problem and actually helping to manage that stressful situation. If that happens, and then we can have that reevaluation. Is that threat still there? Am I still in that challenging situation? Okay, no. And then we evaluate that more positively and the stress cycle starts to minimize. If our behavior didn't work, if we maybe avoid making eye contact with the parent and they're still yelling at us as an example, then we're going to evaluate, okay, things are getting worse now. And so we continue to have that stress cycle. So again, this is very typical. It's aimed to keep us safe. And it can do a very good job at that. It can help us to get out of these situations and help us to manage these situations. But we really want to look at when this can be helpful and when this can be more of a negative thing. What you can see from this slide is obviously we want to get into that situation where stress, we have that, we're able to combine that with rest and get to a growth situation. Stress can be good, as I've been saying, we term that eustress, but typically when that happens, the stress is occurring in kind of short, manageable doses. So you get stressed, you have that conflict with the parent, but you're able to talk things through. And so maybe you don't necessarily look forward to the conversation next time, but you know you've got the communication skills and the problem solving to manage it. It's bad that we have this distress when the stress is chronic and ongoing. So maybe you didn't have a great conversation with the parent, and then you feel like you go home and you get into an argument with your child, and then you go into work the next day and you're kind of irritated there. And all those different stresses can start to accumulate. With some of those different reactions that we have from a physical and a mental perspective, they can actually provide some really good boosts to our bodies and our minds. And obviously that's trying to help us survive. It's trying to help us manage that situation. So it can provide a temporary boost to energy. So if we have that stress response, it gets our heart rate going, it gets our blood flowing, it gets our thoughts going, and that can actually help us to feel more energetic. So even if we look before a competition, if yourself or athletes are feeling nervous, sometimes that can be almost like a good nervous, a nervous energy where you feel like then you're able to go out and perform better because of that. It can also help to increase productivity and efficiency, again, because of how our brain processes are changing, because of how we're scanning information, able to filter through what's most important, hone in on that, and then stay focused on that. So that can help us to really lock in on a task and feel efficient with that. Because again of how those changes are happening in our bodies and minds, it can help us to really feel excited and engaged, where we're able to interact with that person or that environment in a really good way, and help us to go through that process and benefit from it. I'm going to go through the distress piece, and then I'll come back to the question that was in the chat. When we see stress is bad, and obviously the points that are on this slide, both from the eustress and the distress, are just kind of a sampling. But stress is bad because our system is emitting these chemicals, emitting these hormones, activating our cardio system, our respiratory system, all these different systems in our bodies. Basically, our body's on high alert. And because of that, everything's running kind of full tilt with no time to rest and recover. What that can actually do is weakens our immune system, where we feel like we're not able to fight off illnesses as well. That can contribute into fatigue too. When we look at that from a sport perspective though, with a weakened immune system and increased fatigue, that can actually lead to higher levels of injury. And so it's something that athletes and coaches, I think, need to be really aware of, managing stress levels, identifying stressful times in a year or in a training cycle, and being able to look at how you can adjust or accommodate for some of that stress, or provide some coping strategies as a way to try to feel like you're minimizing the likelihood of injury or illness. Because we're so activated, our heart rates increase, our blood pressure increases, our breathing increases, our brain's going 100 miles an hour sometimes, that actually, we're not able to calm that down as much or as easily, and that can interfere with our sleep patterns too. Sometimes it's really difficult to fall asleep. Sometimes it's really difficult to stay asleep. So that sleep's really important to be able to obviously rest and recover. And that's another session that the Sport Med Council offers too. Stress can impact our mood. And so again, with that fight, flight, or freeze, a lot of our mood responses are to try to navigate those different situations. We might feel that irritability or that anger because we're trying to have that aggressive response. We're trying to navigate that from more of a mental, psychological capacity. We might feel that we're really anxious and we're really unsure and we're second guessing everything. We might feel like we're withdrawing. Again, that can sometimes be an avoidance. Sometimes it's just that we're withdrawing and not really doing anything. So that can be in line with the freeze. So the mood can be really impacted, obviously, by stress, and then that obviously impacts our behaviors as well. So just going to the chat box, there's a really good question here. Do you think people are born with these different abilities to deal with stress, or are they more culturally or socially developed based on upbringing? So really good question. Everyone has a stress response. So that in itself is natural. That's how our bodies respond. But so much of how we deal with stress is through, as you mentioned, those social and cultural upbringings and experiences. So when you look at babies, when you look at young children, how they're, how dealing with stress and coping is modeled to them, they pick up on that, but also based on the relationships that they have too. So if they see, for example, a parent or people in their day-to-day lives that get angry every time they experience a stressful situation, they're more likely to respond to that because they think it's effective. Sometimes what will happen is you'll see a parent and a child respond totally opposite, and it's because the parent gets angry and the child thinks, you know what, that's not changing anything. I'm just going to sit here and be quiet and try to avoid. So sometimes you see those opposite patterns based on cultural or social demonstrations. The other thing is if the person maybe hasn't had a good experience with parents or with peers, friends, coaches, expressing their stress, expressing those emotions, being able to talk about it, that can sometimes impact how we're dealing with stress too. We'll see as we move through the session that being able to talk about it, being able to think about it and process it makes a big difference. So what we want to be able to do is process it by talking about it. But if you've been shut down when you try to talk about things you're stressed about or talk about your emotions, that can sometimes make you less likely to do that as well. So I think it can be kind of nurtured into or modeled into how we developed it to, or how we respond to stress. But that doesn't mean that we can't change those coping strategies. Coping strategies are essentially skills and habits and routines. We can always learn new things about that. Okay, so another question. Stress sometimes can take you from eustress to distress. Yeah. So when you go from good stress to bad stress, and is there any way someone can go back to the first phase? Yeah, so we start off maybe having something that is good stress, where we see the situation as something that's elevated, but I can deal with it. It's going to be fairly short. And then all of a sudden things happen and it turns into distress where it's happening for a longer period of time. Typically what you want to do is you want to look at what's happening in that situation to make it feel like it's out of control or out of your resources. Is there a way to try to manage that stress and get it back to something that is under control? So I'll try to think of an example. Maybe not necessarily relevant for coaches, but say there's a student who thinks, okay, you know what, I've got this test, it's one test, I'm going to stay up late and study, I'm going to be really stressed about this one test, but I'm going to get done it and it's going to be fine. And so they feel maybe acute stress, but then they realize they forgot about a test the next day. And so that stress starts to extend to the point where they're maybe not sleeping well, not coping well. Obviously, sometimes that's maybe a limited time frame, but just using that as an example where they're then procrastinating future studying because they're used to staying up and cramming and getting things done. What we want to do is we want to look at what's happening, what's my typical response, and are there ways that I can try to respond differently, add in new stress coping responses, maybe take away typical responses to try to manage it and get it back to that eustress. So we will go over some of that coming up in the presentation, but I just wanted to talk about a couple of those things initially based on the questions that were coming through. This next slide has, I wanted to give a link more specifically to performance. So we're talking about stress kind of in our day-to-day life and obviously giving some sport examples, but this is the inverted U hypothesis. Basically what it's fairly well known, and what it says is that each individual has kind of this range of optimum performance where they need to be somewhat elevated, but not too elevated in order to go out and perform their best. And so we can apply this to athletes. We can also look at what is that for yourself. And so this can shift. So right now it's kind of in the middle. You might see for some people that they have a lower tolerance. Some people they've got a higher tolerance, so it can shift left to right. But if they're underactivated, that's where they're feeling really bored, really unengaged. They're not really interested in what's happening. If the stress gets too high and it gets out of this area of optimum performance, that's when they feel really anxious, really overwhelmed, that it's out of their control, that they're not able to cope well anymore. So ideally, we want to start to look at what is the area of stress or the level of stress that I'm able to manage, what feels comfortable, and just have that understanding for yourself, but also looking at your athletes too. From an athletic perspective, a good starting point is just saying, hey, how nervous, how excited do you want to be before a competition? Some athletes are going to say, I want to be 8 out of 10. Some athletes are going to say, I want to be 3 out of 10. That just gives an example of how it can shift back and forward. And then you start to say, okay, what does that look like for you? How do you get yourself there? And you go through that process of kind of guiding that. But we can do that with other areas. So you've got a big deadline. What kind of stress do you want to feel? You're going back to sport post-COVID. What kind of stress are you feeling? Is that kind of in the range that is going to be helpful for you? With those things in mind, we tend to have a lot of different signs and symptoms in terms of our stress. Divided them into 5 different areas. Again, not the only ones that we can experience, but some really common ones. In terms of affective, these are going to be our emotions. I've talked about some of these already. Feeling really anxious or angry, again, coordinated with the fight or flight response. Sometimes we feel guilty. We've got this evaluation of I should be doing this better. I should be able to cope with this. Sometimes there's that response. We can feel depressed. We can feel really sad because we're just feeling like we're not kind of living up to what we should be able to accomplish or what we should be able to do. Sometimes that can lead into feelings of shame or feeling sorry for yourself. And when stress starts to build too, we can feel helpless. We feel this is out of my control. I'm not able to do anything. I'm not able to respond. And that can then have that helpless response. In terms of behavioral, I've gone through some of these already, but mentioned sleeping disturbances. Sometimes we feel really restless. And again, that's typically because our body's so activated with heart rate, blood rate, breathing rate, all those different things that we just feel jittery and kind of on edge. We might notice that we've got really aggressive behavior, again, linked back to that flight. Sometimes we'll notice drug or alcohol abuse or drug or alcohol use as a way to try to cope and as a way to try to manage. Another one that could be on there that's not would be eating. A lot of people notice that they stress eat, so they start to feel stressed and they're reaching for their foods that make them feel better. We might feel like we're crying, bursting into tears for no reason, not sure why we're having that response. Sometimes behaviorally, we're just underperforming, and obviously we can see that on the sport field where we're ready for the game, we're ready to go out, and then all of a sudden the athletes aren't performing like they should. Absenteeism, when we should be somewhere but we're not. So calling in sick to work, seeing athletes missing practice, those can be signs of absenteeism. Again, it's a form of avoidance. Sometimes what you'll see too is called presenteeism. It's basically where you're there but not engaging, not taking part. So you're kind of going through the motions of the practice or the game or the work or whatever situation that is. Again, we could go into a lot of different physical body behavior. Clenched fists is one. A lot of times we clench our jaw, different things like that, cross our arms. Those can be different behavioral responses as a way to try to just manage that stress. Physiologically, I've talked about a lot of these things: increased muscle tension, increased heart rate. A lot of times because of that muscle tension, if our muscles are really holding that tension, holding that stress, we start to feel pain. Stress headaches are pretty common, but sometimes we'll feel like we've got a stomach ache, or we're feeling like all of a sudden we've got this injury that came out of nowhere, and it can be linked to the stress and the tension that we're experiencing. Again, because of how blood flow changes, we might feel nauseous, we might feel sweaty, butterflies in the stomach, different things that can happen from that perspective, all linked back to how our bodies are responding. Cognitively, again, our brain is processing things different ways. We might feel that we're really frustrated and worried, so we're unsure about what's happening or what will happen, and we're trying to project all those different possibilities so that we can feel like we've got the response. Or just feel like we're snowballing and all those worries are getting bigger. Maybe we're distorting the current situation, making it seem like it's not quite as based in reality as it could be, exaggerating things, making it seem bigger. So with the bear, you come back and you say, yeah, the bear was massive, and maybe it was, but maybe you're kind of exaggerating. Or yeah, that parent was just screaming at me, whereas they had raised their voice. So sometimes those things can get exaggerated. Sometimes too, again, from a more sport perspective, we have these unrealistic performance expectations where you get stressed and all of a sudden you just think that you need to be perfect. And so you're putting this valuation on how you're playing and feeling like you need to be better. Along with that, we can feel that we're really self-defeating, getting really negative, thinking about failure, just because we've got this possibility that we might not do the best that we can or do as well as we want to. And that can trigger some of those worries to come through in that negative thinking. Again, the last one, looking at interpersonal, how we're interacting with other people. Again, with that avoidance, with that flight, we might have withdrawal. So we're not talking to people as much, we're not making eye contact, we're just trying to avoid social settings. We might feel really irritated. Again, some of that aggression coming out. Sometimes what happens is we're concerned about others over self. So we're looking at other people's needs, trying to take care of them as a way to like almost externalize some of the things that we're going through and focus on something else. Manipulation can happen where we feel like we're trying to just gain control over anything, and maybe manipulation in terms of those relationships is happening. And argumentative, where we're just building things up and getting into it with other people. So again, there's lots of information on this slide. What we're going to do is how do you typically respond to stress? And I'm going to show you the question, but I'm going to flip back to this page because I think it's helpful to have all these examples up as we're reflecting on that. Again, this is just for you. You don't need to share this. If you want to, you're more than welcome to, but just go through and note some of the things that you observe when you start to get stressed. Okay, and so again, like I said, not necessarily asking you to share. I'm happy to, if you want to put them in the chat box, you're more than welcome to. What we want to do here is, number one, recognize what are my common stress signs and symptoms. The second piece, though, is recognizing, do I tend to have a range of signs and symptoms? Are they within all 5 of these different categories? Or do I tend to notice them more within 1 or 2 of these? And again, it's just more for observation, more for awareness, but it can be really interesting just to start thinking about these things. Yeah, we've got a good comment in here, just looking at once we have this stress, what we want to do. And so there's a couple of good examples. Taking deep breaths, being able to exercise, being able to work or try to shift your focus. So yeah, lots of really good examples that are coming up. And in a couple more slides, I'm going to share some additional ones just to be able to give you some ideas too. The next question, and I'm going to flip ahead to, what helps you to manage stress? So you're right on target with those things that you're writing down. It's as if you had seen the slide. But just thinking, based on those signs and symptoms, based on what you're feeling stressed about right now, what have you been doing? What have you been doing to try to manage this stress? You might notice that some of these things are really helpful. You might notice that, say, if you're stress eating, maybe makes you feel better short term, but maybe long term it's not helping. Or maybe there's something else that you're doing that, okay, I get really irritable and it helps to get it off my chest, but then I need to go say sorry to someone afterwards. So what are those things that you do? And again, these can be healthy or unhealthy, but just taking a minute to think about those for yourself. Okay, awesome. We're getting some really good ones in the chat box. Doing activities. So yeah, trying to think about things that you enjoy, things that you like. Having those activities outside of what you're stressed on. So if you're really stressed in one area, having other things to do, like going to the gym, playing music, going and playing something, making to-do lists. So yeah, trying to look at all these different things and getting your priorities and getting those tasks and trying not to focus too much on one thing. Sport usually works best. So soccer's a time that you can go and forget about everything else that's going on. So yeah, I think it's really awesome to hear what you're doing. And it's important to be able to identify those, but also looking at how you can use those. And obviously, if you're using them, it's because they work for you. What I want to do with the last 10, 15 minutes, something like that, is just go over another slide of strategies. And some of these are going to be pretty straightforward, pretty basic, ones that you're very familiar with, just linking it back to the stress response and why it's helpful. But hopefully there's maybe 1 or 2 on here that you haven't thought of or that you don't do. And I'm going to obviously encourage you to think about what could you try or what could you add in, maybe helps you to manage your stress in a new or different way. Okay, so managing stress. I'm going to start at the very top. Deep breathing was one that was in the chat box, and it's perfect. We hear about it all the time, and some people are like, okay, well, breathing's not going to make that much of a difference for me. But if we think back to how our body actually responds when we get stressed, we have that increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, increased blood pressure. We can't control our heart rate, or it's difficult for most people to do. We can't control our blood pressure. We can control our breathing. And because our breathing is tied to our heart, which is tied to our blood pressure, that's the easiest thing to have control over. And so being able to focus on taking those long, slow, deep breaths can be really helpful as a way to try to calm yourself down and get your body from that activated mode to more of a relaxed mode. And so some people like to have like very specific numbers in terms of breathe in for 5, hold for 3, exhale for 5. If you want that, go for it. What I'm going to recommend is do what feels comfortable. So just have a long, slow inhale, hold it if you want, and then exhale. Sometimes one deep breath helps. Sometimes you want to do it for a few just to feel like you're getting that cycle going and really help to move the oxygen and move the blood in your body. In terms of muscle relaxation, again, we've noticed that our bodies tend to get tense We hold that stress, we hold that muscle tension as a way to have that basically stored potential to then fight or be able to run away. But what we want to do is look at how we can actually release some of that muscle tension. And part of that's recognizing individually if we hold muscle tension and where that is. So again, sometimes it's going to be in our jaw, sometimes in our necks or our shoulders. Again, we might have clenched fists. Sometimes it's through like our glutes, or we notice that we're clenching our feet. Just noticing where maybe you collect some tension. And with that, what we want to do is, if it's already feeling kind of tight, we want to take it and we want to squeeze it gently. We don't want to squeeze it too hard, especially if like you're in your feet or your jaw or your neck, because you don't want to hurt it, but just increase the muscle tension slightly. You hold it there for a little bit and then you release it. And if you can, you kind of wiggle it out. So like stretch your neck or wiggle your jaw or kind of shake your hand out. And what that does is you purposely increase the tension, and then by releasing it, it helps to relax it to a lower level. And again, that muscle relaxation can start to trigger some of the other calming activities within our body. So those are obviously both physical responses. What I want to do through a lot of these different strategies is give you a variety. So again, just like everyone has different typical responses to stress, maybe you know it's mostly behavioral and physiological, we tend to have different coping responses. And sometimes it's very mental, sometimes it's very physical, sometimes it's very emotional. Again, the more variety that we can have, it just helps us to be better supported. In terms of visualizing success, again, often what happens when we start to feel stress is that we start to think about those things that could happen. We start to worry, we start to feel overwhelmed. That can really shift us into that negative perspective. In terms of visualizing success, we think, okay, I'm stressed right now. What do I want to happen? How do I want to manage this? And so you see yourself working through that in a very positive way. Maybe it's through that process, maybe it's looking at the end result, but that visualization can actually be really helpful in terms of resetting our brain and getting us thinking about what we can do and what's going to be most helpful. Again, we talk about visualization from a sport perspective. It's one of those things that can be really helpful. We can use it in other areas as well. When we look at mindfulness, this is one of those things that, again, we could probably spend a whole session on. Mindfulness is basically, in a way that I like to describe it, maybe not in the best fit for everyone, but being present and being aware of what's going on for you in the moment. And so with this, I do an activity called Take 5, where basically we just go through different senses and pay attention to them. We start off with 5 things, and we name 5 things that we can see right now. And so you scan your environment, you look for those different things. It actually pauses you, makes you pause and kind of name them. And so you go through that. Sometimes if you want, you can cater it thinking, okay, what are 5 blue things that I can see? And then you have to scan a little bit more purposely too. So you start off with those 5 things you can see, and then you go down to 4 things that you can hear, or sorry, 4 things that you can feel. And I use the word feel very purposely because there's different ways that we can do this. When we think about feel, we can think about it from a touch perspective. So what are 4 things that I can touch? And so you can reach out and touch those things. For example, right now I'm at my desk, it's kind of like a wood grain. You can feel the roughness of that. The water bottle's smooth and cold right now. So you can pay attention to the sensations that come with that. We can also look at, what does my body feel? So you know what, it's kind of warm right now. I noticed that my feet are on the carpet. Like, you can go through and you can actually think about how your body feels or the body position. You can also use feeling in terms of an emotional perspective. So what do I feel emotionally right now? And you can name those 4 different emotions. So lots of different ways that you can do it. No right or wrong, just based on your preference there. Then we go down to 3 things. And again, this is 3 things that we can hear. Depending on where you're at and what you're doing, you might be very aware of some of that background noise. Sometimes, as I've been talking for most of the last hour, I start to tune out the other things because I'm paying attention to this webinar. But as I start talking about this, I notice that my computer's whirring, just trying to keep the fan cool. Or the fan is trying to keep the computer cool. I know that my kids are home now, so there's some banging downstairs, and you start to hear those different things that are going on around you. Then you go down to 2 things, and you think about 2 things that you can taste or smell. And I like to group these together because lots of times we're less available to some of those senses. And if you're in an environment where it feels like there's not really anything, can you have a drink of water? Can you take a deep breath and feel the cool air in your nose and your mouth? Those can be different ways to try to prime that. And then last one's 1. You think about 1 thing that you think about 1 deep breath. You take that deep breath and you exhale, and it's just a nice way to try to round that off. So again, a quick mindfulness technique that can be really helpful. You can do it a lot of different places. Have a routine. So a lot of times when we start feeling stressed, again, it comes back to us feeling like we're out of control, overwhelmed, that things are outside of our coping strategies. Having this routine creates predictability. It influences our habits. With our habits, we don't have to think about them as much because we've established them. That can be really helpful because it frees up that brain space, but it also is something that can be really calming and help to soothe us. And so as an example, you hear about babies and young kids needing that bedtime routine. That can be something that's really helpful for adults. And even just thinking about how you typically get ready for bed, what are the things that you do? Is that helping you to transition from day to night into sleep? And that's ultimately what a bedtime routine is doing, is it's setting you up for the night. Same thing, what's your morning routine like? Again, you're transitioning from sleep into your day, and what do you need to do to get yourself ready? Anyways, having a routine for those different times when you do feel stressed, or pre-game routine, or some of those different situations, it can be really helpful. Again, it just minimizes some of that overthinking and helps you to feel like you're more in control. As we've noted previously too, positive self-talk can be a really helpful one because we tend to feel overwhelmed and we start to think maybe negatively or feel more helpless or just feel like we're getting down on ourselves. Again, depending on what kinds of thoughts you might have, sometimes it's going to be having things planned out that you can be really encouraging for yourself. You know what? I can do this, it's stressful, but I know that I can manage stress in a positive way. Or maybe it's something that's more feedback. Okay, first I'm gonna make this list and then I'm going to pick my number one priority. So sometimes it's just kind of talking yourself through it. Sometimes it's gonna be really instructional. Sometimes it's gonna be more positive or more encouraging. Again, just thinking about cues that might be helpful for you to manage that stress. Taking care of your body. So again, we know that stress can have a huge impact on our minds and our bodies. Just looking at some of those basic day-to-day things. So being able to get enough sleep, being able to eat a variety of foods, being able to drink enough water, talking to people, being able to express your emotions. Those are maybe less body specific, but it's all about taking care of yourself and taking care of those different aspects. That can be a really kind of baseline way to feel like you're managing your stress. And some of those are pieces that tend to go when we feel stressed. So if we're rushed for time, we maybe stop at the drive-thru and grab something quick, or grab a really quick snack, and maybe it's not the food that you would typically choose. So you're sacrificing sleep to try to stay up and get something done, as examples. Take a break. So we remember back to that equation, stress plus rest equals growth. Okay, let's take a break. Let's look at that rest. Let's look at how we can have a quick reset physically, a quick reset mentally, as a way to just try to calm our bodies down in that moment and then get back to what we need to do. And then again, because we tend to place a lot of emphasis on failure and how that impacts us, just reminding yourself, reminding your athletes too, mistakes happen. It's part of what we go through. Everyone's going to experience them, and being able to evaluate them, experience them, learn from them, and then use that to help yourself cope and manage stress more effectively the next time. I'm going to pause. I know there's lots of different coping strategies on here. I've got, I think, a couple more slides before we wrap up, but I just wanted to see if there's any questions with this specifically before I move on.
Hey, Lisa, yeah, it's really interesting as you're going through. I'm just thinking about sort of the, top level pro player or the, elite athlete. And a lot of times, I haven't really seen all that many studies, but there's sort of research looking at their, environment in terms of, what kind of, childhood they have and heartaches and things like this. And most of those pros at least have some sort of story of being an underdog or, coming from a tough upbringing to make it. And, looking at that as a reality of, something that, a lot of us don't, in our environment here potentially, but, how is that sort of connected to, and can you exposing that levels of stress to the players, and where's that sort of fine balance point? John Herdman says it well of, this until you go through the stress or out of your cage, that's where the magic happens. And sort of connecting that into how do we get that for our players without either going over the top and being a sort of a dangerous environment, or sort of, but making sure that it's monitored and maintained. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are really good points too. Part of what we want to do is we want to basically expose people to stress. And hopefully expose them to small bits of stress, even if you're just looking at it from a physical training perspective. We don't start off the first day of practice with the hardest workout of the season. We help them progress into that. And same thing with more of a mental stress or a challenging situation. We want to help them experience it, learn how to manage it, know that they've gone through it, build that confidence, build that success, maybe build some of that learning from mistakes or things they would change, and then start to progress some of those stressful situations. And again, it's just about growing that ability. And I think a big part of that's that resilience. If they have had difficult experiences or upbringings, looking at how they work through that and what they've done to get to where they are right now. And those can also be really helpful things to just realize that they do have those skills to manage stress. It's maybe they're thinking about it in a different way. I'm happy to have more conversation. I'm going to flip ahead to the next slide. We've talked a lot about stress. We've talked a lot about that it's natural, it's normal, it's something that we go through. It's something that can be very helpful. It's something that, though, can be negative. And what I want to highlight here is that when stress and anxiety become a concern, there's lots of different resources to reach out for help. You can talk to a mental performance consultant as a way to maybe manage it from a sport perspective. You can also talk to a psychologist as a way to manage that maybe day-to-day anxiety. And so generally what you're going to see if it's becoming at a level that feels like it's out of control, number one, even if you don't meet these criteria and feel like you're stressed or anxious and not able to cope, talk to someone, because that's still going to be helpful. They're still going to give you suggestions and strategies to work through it. Number two, this would typically be more in line with kind of a diagnosed anxiety or something that's becoming more clinical. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. It just means that maybe you need some extra assistance. And so generally what we're going to see is excessive anxiety. And this is going to be in a number of different areas of your life. So it might start off in sport, but then you realize you're not coping well at work or at school. And then you realize that you're not coping well at home with your relationships because you're feeling so stressed. And it starts to just, the anxiety and stress builds into a number of different areas. And it feels like that stress, that anxiety, that worry is very difficult to control. And so it feels like it's something that's just piling up and you're not able to do anything. Again, a lot of these symptoms I've noted already, but what we're seeing is that these are prolonged. They're happening for a long period of time, in addition to those general symptoms that I've already talked about. So that edginess or that restlessness, again, just feeling like you're on edge, not able to relax, really tired, more fatigued than usual, difficulty sleeping because of that sometimes, just feeling like you're having a lot of difficulties concentrating, feeling like your mind goes blank and you can't focus on anything. Sometimes you're going to be really irritable, and you might feel irritable to yourself and no one else is picking up on it. Or your partner, your spouse, your friend, your colleague might say, think you've been really irritable lately, what's going on? And so it might be observable, but it might not be. Again, we've talked about aches or soreness. Again, sometimes because of that tension that we're holding, sometimes just because of how the changes in our body are affecting us, because we're not recovering as well, or our immune system's not operating as well, lots of different things. So again, the key thing here is be aware of these, obviously, for yourself, for your athletes. But if you feel like you're struggling, don't wait to meet these criteria to reach out and get help. I just wanted to add that in. And again, just to summarize this, I know there's lots of information in the session today. Ultimately, we want to move to the point where we have balance between stress and rest. We want to make sure that it doesn't have to be equal. We're spending like 50% of our time in stress and 50% in rest, but just some sort of balance that feels good and manageable for yourself. And that combination is then going to lead to that growth, both physically and mentally. And because of that, we're able to start gaining, we're able to start making that progress, and just recognizing that stress can be a very good thing. It can be bad sometimes, but it's a very natural reaction as a way to try to protect ourselves and keep us safe. Part of what we did today too was just looking at what are my own stress tendencies. What are some of the things that I notice when I do get stressed? What are some of the things that I'm stressed about right now? What are some of the thoughts that I have? What are some of the behaviors that I have? Again, just that awareness. And then ultimately what we want to do is look at how do I typically cope with that stress? Are there ways that I feel I'm managing it really well, things that I want to continue? Are there things maybe that I want to take out because they're not helping me? Are there things that maybe I want to add in? And again, just looking at how you can cope with your own stress, because that's going to make a big difference in terms of how you're functioning day to day, including as a coach, but it's also going to give you that ability to support the other people in your life, athletes, partners, children's, co-workers, all those different people that are part of your life. And again, I'm happy to answer questions. I know we're a couple of minutes over 5:30 right now, but if you have questions, I'm happy to stick around and have a conversation. I know in the past there have been some really good questions coming out of these sessions.
Hey, Lisa, do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I just got 2 questions actually, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
So the first one, this is my personal view, and I want your point of view about it. I see the stress that there is 2 types of stress. That's the positive, like for example, I'm gonna bring the coaching as an example here. Like when somebody is really giving you feedback, helping you to get better, and I see it as a positive stress because it motivates me somehow. And there is also the negative stress when someone's asking you to accomplish this and this and this, but he or she is not providing you with the environment or any condition at all. Just asking you out of the blue to do this, accomplish this and this and this, but there is no environment to even accomplish that. So I just want your point of view about this. And the second question, it's for my coaching, because sometimes this passion we have inside us as coaches, and we want to do this and this, so we push on the players, like we want them to accomplish some goals. It's realistic goals, but it just sometimes I get concerned. Maybe I'm stressing those players,
right?
You know, like I want them to get to that level, but at the end there is like a different level of enthusiast within the group.
Yeah, no, really good questions. So the first one, in terms of, yeah, there definitely can be some situations where that stress is good. You're getting that feedback and you're using that as a way to get better. It's interesting because some people will see that situation, they'll want to shy away from feedback because they feel like it's a negative reflection of themselves, or they don't have the capacity maybe to think about that and integrate it as a way to get better. So sometimes it's just looking at this and thinking, okay, and even with the example, like you said, sometimes it's bad. Just being able to reflect on it can be helpful. Okay, is this something that is reflecting on me and my skills? Like, do I have the capacity to deal with this? What am I currently doing? What could I do? Sometimes those are just different things to reflect on when you're feeling that good stress, but also when you're feeling that bad stress. And sometimes when we're feeling that bad stress, because we're having that response, we tend to sometimes get away from our typical reactions. So maybe when we get that feedback and it's a good stress, we're thinking positively, we're thinking about how we can grow, how we can do better. But maybe when we get that negative feedback or that those time constraints from others around us, maybe we're lacking that. So just being able to evaluate yourself and see where you're at with that. Sometimes that can be helpful, just to look at the differences between those 2 situations. So that would be maybe an initial comment on that. With the second question, in terms of sometimes there's a range of how people respond to stress and how, I guess, what the different investment in a team is. That can be difficult because you're wanting, obviously, to set goals and have everyone work together. I guess this is maybe less stress related, but sometimes it's looking at what motivates people and being able to understand why they're in it, what they want to work towards, being able to understand those individually, and looking at, okay, this person is going to respond really well if I'm really encouraging. This person's going to respond really well if I ask them questions. So it's just being able to try to look at people and understand the differences as a way to get the most out of them. So that would just be, I guess, maybe a general start to those questions. I'm not sure if that answered them or not.
No, that's great, Lisa. Yeah, thank you very much. No, that's great stuff.
Yeah, you're welcome. Perfect. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so as always, if there are questions, I'm more than happy to answer, obviously now. Down the road, if you're wanting to reach out to me, Soccer has my email address. It's mental.trainer@sasktel.net. So you're more than welcome to send me an email and ask questions too if you think of something following this and you want to just have a quick follow-up. I'm happy to do that as well. Otherwise, I do really appreciate everyone joining today, and I'll stop my share, and then I'm not sure if there's anything else you need to go over before we wrap up for the evening.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Again, really appreciate your time with us tonight. And to Leonard and Mo, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate you guys jumping on to most of these calls and taking the time for your schedule as well, too. So, yeah, fantastic stuff. Really interesting topic. I'm going to be thinking about this one for a while. So, very good, and appreciate that topic tonight. So,
perfect. Sounds good. Well, thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. We'll talk to you guys soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks,
you're
Marcus.
welcome.
Thanks, Leonard.
Bye.